You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
You may have seen yesterday at True North, my colleague Cosmin Georgia published what I thought was a tremendously researched story, one of these hidden in plain sight reports. It was based on the Canadian Military Journal, which is the official publication. It's more academic in nature, but the official publication of the Canadian Armed Forces. And while it's not a product, it's not a communications product of the Department of National Defense, it is official, and it is where the military gets a lot of its theoretical and practical material from, clearly. Because what we saw in this issue is it was dedicated to unmasking and exposing patriarchy and whiteness and white supremacy. I believe we have the table of contents for you here. This is one issue, the summer issue, getting to the root of the problem. There is an article about interrogating whiteness and power in the Canadian Armed Forces. There's an article about whether supporting military families is reinforcing patriarchy. There is an article about gender identity and military culture. There are articles about women's experiences, feminism, and the military. But the bulk of this is saying that the military is upholding white supremacy and patriarchy. This idea that the military is clearly behind, and you wonder why they're having so much difficulty with morale, because they're telling all the men and all the white people that, well, you guys just don't really matter. You people don't want to be too gendered about this. I wanted to get some veteran perspective on this because, again, I've heard so many members of the Canadian Armed Forces. My father is a veteran, and I know many people in my family and in your families, and many of you listening have served in the armed forces as well. I wanted to welcome into the show Tom Marazzo, who you've heard from on a number of occasions, a former captain with the armed forces and also the author of the People's Emergency Act, as well as Drew MacGillivray, who's the president of Veterans for Freedom. Drew and Tom, it's great to talk to you both. Thanks for being with us here, and thanks for your service. I mean, let me just ask first and foremost here, how does this publication and how the military has gone on this issue make you feel about your service, this body that you devoted a chunk of your lives to? I'll start with you, Drew.
It's pretty alarming. You know, I'm one of the guys who's, and I was going to put in 25, 30 years. And, you know, I joined because I was a patriotic Canadian. I grew up in Scarborough, which is located in Toronto, very multicultural neighborhood. And then they're pushing this stuff and they're forcing it on the troops. And then I look back at my 12-year career and I say, you know, why did I do this? This isn't the institution, this isn't the country that I signed up to defend and ultimately was willing to risk my life for. And it's completely disrespectful to the troops and the soldiers that are still in there. And, you know, this has been a trajectory they've been going down for the past couple months. So it just is what it is, unfortunately.
And I'll put the same question to you, Tom.
Well, I do find it completely offensive, to be perfectly honest. You know, my time in the military, and I did 25 years total, I was a reservist and I was a regular force member. And, you know, the vast majority of people that join the Canadian Armed Forces are rural members, some small towns, but the vast majority of people that join are Caucasian males and females of a Christian ethnicity or Christian descent. And, you know, they're very patriotic Canadians. And, you know, this idea of whiteness, like it's how do you justify the concept of white supremacy when your entire unit that you're in, let's say as an example, your entire platoon or your company or even your regiment, when the vast majority of the people in there are Caucasians who are, you know, come from a Christian background. And I'm not suggesting that everybody is religious. I'm saying that their religious morals and ethics and their values derive from a Christian upbringing in a largely Christian society. So where does the white supremacy come in when you look around and everybody's white? Like, who are we supremacist against? Like, it's kind of offensive to sit there and say that there's this you know, racism or deep dislike for somebody who doesn't look like you based on your skin color in the Canadian Forces, when the reality is, if anybody who's done basic training knows, your personality is stripped down to the bare essence of who you are as a Canadian, and you're rebuilt as a soldier or a sailor or an airman. You're not rebuilt as a Christian or a Muslim, or you're not from India or whatever. Like, these things are very blurred to paint this very nefarious picture that doesn't make any sense. Because from, as far as I'm concerned and everything I was ever taught in the military, you're a soldier first. That's what matters. And can you be relied upon to defend the lives of your brothers and sisters in arms? Nobody's looking at your ethnicity. Nobody's looking at your religion. Nobody's looking at your whiteness. They're looking at, in the case of the Army, they're looking at a guy or girl who's, camouflaged. And are they competent and willing and able to do the business of war, the business of violence, not the business of social engineering? And this is what a lot of this crap that we're seeing is all about. It's not about warfare. It's not about defending Canada. It's trying to hypnotize certain portions of Canadians to vote Liberal. And I hope we can get into that discussion as well.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask, because you raised, I think, an important point there. I mean, my understanding of this is not someone who's served, but someone who's had family members who have, is that uniformity was always a very core part of the military. And it was meant to basically be exactly what you've just described there. Your role has to be the uniform, not who you are as an individual when you're serving. And I think it was 2 years ago that they significantly dropped the standards on uniformity, where you could have dyed hair and face tattoos. No offense to people with dyed hair and face tattoos, but a little bit. I'm okay offending a little bit of the face tattoo crowd. But the thing about that is that here we have the military, and I understand why, because if you have no recruitment and you have no people there, I understand the impulse to just start dropping all these barriers. But I think it has an inverse relationship, because all of a sudden you change it so much that the people you want in there are saying, I don't know if I want to be a part of that anymore. But it seems like the military has gone along with this very woke academic idea that everyone needs to be this celebrated individual snowflake, which is a complete reversal. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Drew, but of what the military has always been about and what it needs to be a success at its goals.
Yeah, so ultimately, there's a guy named Andy Stump who does a podcast called Cleared Hot, and when he was asked about diversity in the SEALs, and he felt that they were, did they lose anything by the lack of diversity? And his answer, which I've remembered verbatim because it was the perfect answer, he said, well, I don't know. He goes, are we aiming for diversity, or are we aiming to achieve a standard? And that standard is dictated to us by what we encounter on the battlefield. And the battlefield doesn't give a crap about diversity, which is ultimately the best answer I've ever heard. And it's when you get into uniform, you get discriminated against generally in three ways. Okay, it's your element, so either Army, Navy, or Air Force, your trade, and your rank, and that's just to build esprit de corps, and there's banter and that sort of thing. No one cares about the color of your skin or what's between your legs. We care about what is between your ears. So all of this stuff that's happening with academia and what they're doing, it's being funded by the government. And what's worrisome is we're seeing a similarity between what's happened in China with the CCP and what's happening here. And what I mean is that in China, their military is beholden to the party. It's beholden to the CCP and not the state. And we're starting to see that here in Canada, is that the Canadian Armed Forces is becoming beholden to the Liberal Party and their ideology and not the state.
This idea that we're seeing, because the whole, like, we're a systemically racist institution, that goes back a couple of years now. This article or the series of articles from the summer that True North reported on yesterday, was this really a creation of the last couple of years, or did you start to see this, both of you, near the end of your service? And I don't know what years you left, but had you started to see shades of this trend then, or has it really just been a blunt instrument as of late?
Yeah, so I'll speak to that just ahead of Tom, because I know he got out a while ago. I just got out just over 2 years ago. And
did we lose Drew?
I hear him. I don't see him.
I don't see him either.
It might come back. I'm in the
There's
middle
a
of
snowstorm in
here,
his
so.
part of Ontario.
All right. Well, I'll go to you first,
Sure.
Tom, while we're getting Drew sorted out.
So in the early 90s, like I left the military in 2015, but even in the early to mid 90s, we had this training program. It was called SHARP. It was an acronym for sexual harassment and all these things. And we had to undergo a lot of this training, but it was interesting because the training was put on by non-veterans or currently serving military. They were, academic think tank people coming in and trying to reshape the culture of the military. Yet none of the people who were responsible for creating this training ever served in the military, so they don't understand the culture. And what I found really interesting about your colleague in the article that was put out, you've got these academics who are academically tied to the Defense Academy in Kingston, yet I see no evidence that they actually ever served in uniform. So how is it that they are trying to reshape currently the culture of the military, wherein in the past, they've never even been part of it? And this is a problem when academics try to get involved in a culture that they don't fully appreciate because they haven't even so much as done basic training. Now, I've done basic training once in the reserves, and then as an officer, I had to redo it. And yes, there are training evolutions you go through. Annually, there are some things, but it's never been as obvious and egregious as it is right now, where they've gone so far to attack things like, even masculinity. I mean, I'm sorry, but we need aggressive men and women in uniform who do the business of violence. Okay. And I find, you raised the example of the, the tattoos and the dyed hair and even the nail polish and earring. In my day, that was absolutely unheard of. Okay. You had to be focused on the business of war, not the business of social engineering like we're seeing right now. And yes, this has slowly been creeping in over years, but since this current Liberal government has gone in, they have completely terraformed the Canadian Armed Forces into something very non-serious. I mean, if Canada were to go to war today, who in the hell would be intimidated by the fact that the Canadians are now coming? And I want to leave this one last point. Rommel had said the perfect military, the most deadly military in the world, would have been German officers, American equipment, and Canadian soldiers. And I don't think that equation holds true any longer, unfortunately.
Yeah, and to your point about masculinity, I'm not sure any Afghan girls that had an education for the first time in their lives because of the Canadian military and other allied forces there. I don't think they were complaining about toxic masculinity when the soldiers came to town against the Taliban, just to give one recent example here. Drew, you got cut off by technology there. We were talking about kind of when this started, and I'm curious about your experience here.
Yeah, so I got out just over 2 years ago, and the anti-racism and DEI training was just starting to trickle in. I was someone who was told that I had to go into the communist-style struggle sessions where they said, "Oh, all white men bad," not even be putting on by current military members. It was being put on by government, their bureaucrats and stuff who were coming down and doing this training in academia. And really, in 6 years, we have seen 3 instances of right-wing extremism or white supremacy in the CAF. It was Patrick, Matthews, Boris, Mihaljevic, and then the Proud Boy incident in 2017. That's 3 incidents. For my last year at the recruiting center in Toronto, we saw 3 instances of attacks on our recruiting center. 2 were by, jihadi type attacks, and 1 was done by a left-wing Antifa woman. And the media wasn't down there reporting on those, but you can sure believe if it was some sort of white supremacist attack on our recruiting center, they would have been down there reporting it. So they've been pushing this bogus narrative for a while, and you can talk to any current serving member. Morale's at an all-time low because of these commie-style struggle sessions that's being forced on them. That's not what the job of the military is. If you ask an infantier, their job is to close with and destroy the enemy. They don't care who's beside them as long as they're well trained and they can trust them with their lives. So this has been coming, and it's going to continue to come, and there's no pushback from senior leadership within the military. I have an email chain saved that I had with a vice admiral where he was telling me to read Anti-Racist by Ibrahim X. Kendi. And I read it and I pushed back to him. I said, this goes completely against the ethos of the Canadian Armed Forces. So we're going to continue to see this, and we get all sorts of tips and emails from serving members telling us the stuff that they have to go through. And that's why the attrition rate is 3 times the regular rate. And that's why guys like me who released earlier getting out, because it's just nonsense. And we're not like the Canadian Armed Forces isn't the passport office. Okay. We are a completely different entity in society. And there's just so much creep stuff that's crept in from the likes of, Barbara Perry and the Ontario Technical Institute. And they just gave a bunch of money to a man named Andy Knight, who's a University of Alberta professor, who's going to study white supremacy in the Canadian Armed Forces. So it's just a false and bogus narrative, in my opinion.
Is your sense, Tom, that the military leadership have bought into this, or are they just basically taking their marching orders from cabinet and government, or seeing the writing on the wall and that this is the way things are going?
Yeah, absolutely. I do believe that the senior leadership of the Canadian Forces has bought completely into this. And, I tweeted about this yesterday where, there was the American veterans and currently serving members have created this declaration of accountability where, there's a group of over 200, I believe 230 currently serving and retired American veterans who want accountability against the Joint Chiefs of Staff for all of their actions during COVID. And, my tweet was actually about the same thing, is that the Canadian Armed Forces members have the same duty. I mean, you learn this in basic training in the first week when you're covering military law. You, as a subordinate rank, when you're trained, have a duty to report a crime if you witness it being committed, and if so, actually lay charges. And that doesn't matter if the person committing the crime is of a higher rank than you. You've got a duty to take action because, it's a professional organization with its own body of laws. It's got its own criminal justice system. It has its own mechanisms to deal with these things. And the fact that right now, the currently serving military members have never taken their superior officers to task tells you, it speaks volumes about the state of buy-in from senior leaders who are protecting their careers, not the integrity of the institution of the Canadian Armed Forces, but they're protecting their careers. They're not risking their pensions or their livelihoods or their reputations on pushing back against this ideology. And I think that in itself is a massive leader of failure, or a failure of leadership on behalf of, let's say, lieutenant colonels and above, or even majors who are the first rank of senior officer. Very few instances we've seen this. I can think of one major that did a video in uniform where he pushed back against the actions of the senior leadership of the forces, but that's the only example I can come up with. And, I believe some people should stay in and fight from the inside, try to make it better. But the reality is that the best people are going to get out of the way. They're going to leave the military, and the garbage is going to percolate to the top. And they're going to occupy those senior positions within the Canadian Forces, and they will remain beholden to the Liberal Party of Canada, not to Canadians, not to the institution of the Canadian Armed Forces. That's where their loyalties are going to lie in their next promotion. And their next promotion is going to be contingent on how woke you are and how much you abide by this gender ideology and all these other things, right? I mean, we have quotas. 25% of all the occupations we want to fill by women. That's not based on capability. That's based on this bizarre quota of what your gender is and what your skin color is. It's not based on capability. And up until recently, the fundamental idea was that your capabilities were what earned you the position within the Canadian Armed Forces. You don't have the right to join the Canadian Armed Forces. You have the right to apply. You don't have to be accepted. But to be accepted, you have to meet a minimum standard. And Drew could probably talk about what's happening now with the CFAT score, which is the Canadian Forces Aptitude Test. So, I do think that there's some nefarious things happening so that senior officers can get promoted into more advanced positions than they currently hold.
Well, yeah, and obviously if we are embracing diversity and DEI and anti-whiteness and anti-colonialism and all of this, which you clearly are, we see this in the documentation, it stands to reason that that's going to become at the core of hiring and promotion practices. And I mean, obviously, no true meritocracy really exists. There are always biases and nepotism and things that can seep their way in. But the idea that senior military strategists or people who are supposed to be strategists are going to be decided based on how many diversity checkboxes you can tick isn't really all that far off, is it, Drew? I mean, and you think, this is the whole point of that intersectionality idea that these academics who have never served, as Tom points out, are talking about here. It's that, this guy may have led, 20 successful campaigns, but, this one's a transgendered Indigenous person in a wheelchair. This is our new admiral.
No, exactly. And I'll just touch base on one thing that Tom said is the difference. So we know, and we're, partnered with the American guys who put forth that military accountability document. The difference down there is they actually have senior officers who are signed on to this, guys with credibility and who are known within the community. With V4F, we're at over 3,000 members. We have a handful of four-ringers, so either captain navies or colonels, but we haven't had any sort of major general or admiral push back and step up and speak. Now, General Mason has been doing some good work. He's been speaking out against sort of the wokeness affecting the CAF, which is great, but there needs to be more senior officers and senior NCOs who speak out about this stuff. And that's, sorry, what was your question again, Andrew? I guess I lost my train.
I can't remember. Your answer was good enough, but I was basically just asking about whether diversity hires are going to become the new norm with how things are going. And, the general, the vice admiral, all these leaders are not going to be people that were these, brilliant tacticians and strategists and operators, but are actually just going to be people that are chosen for these intersectional diversity categories.
Yeah. So you're 100% spot on. So when I was in recruiting, so I was a military career counselor, I would really sign off on the files to get them sort of approved and onto the competition list, which has been watered down. But at that time, women who were applying to the Canadian Armed Forces didn't have to pass the aptitude test to be able to be approved and put on the thing. So they had lowered the standards there for women just to get them on the list. And I talk about how they actually select applicants, but that's a whole nother story. It is now, this is something that we released on our social medias yesterday, is for just under 50% of the trades in the Canadian Armed Forces, they've waived the requirement to pass the Canadian Forces aptitude test. And that aptitude test tests you in three things. It tests you in math, it tests you in English, it tests you on your spatial awareness. And based on your scores, it will dictate to us, the military career counselors, what occupations you're good for. That's not even happening anymore. So 47 trades no longer require that aptitude test. Now, I talked to our source at CFRG, which is Canadian Forces Recruiting Group headquarters, and he said that this is being done for two reasons. One, to help push through the 2,600 permanent residents who've applied to the Canadian Armed Forces, and two, to help meet the what we call EE employment equity quotas, which I believe is 25% women. These are the goals: 25% women, 15% visible minority, and I think it's 4 or 5% Indigenous. So they're lowering the standard of the troops in the military to help achieve their DEI targets, which is, it's unacceptable. You never lower the standard, especially when people's lives are on the line.
I mean, that used to be when this came up with firefighters years ago. This used to be the most obvious pushback on this, which is, someone like me doesn't drop 100 pounds if the firefighter is a woman. So this is, I think, the painful reality here. Well, I'm glad you gentlemen are speaking up about this. Thank you for your service and for your time today. Drew MacGillivray from Veterans for Freedom and Tom Marazzo, also from Veterans for Freedom, but also the author of the book, The People's Emergency Act. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.